Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. When a ruling party starts arresting its own inner circle, that's usually a stress fracture. Governments that actually fight corruption start with the present tense. Governments that stage internal purges start with the past and the suddenly inconvenient. Georgia's leadership says this is zero tolerance. The question is whether zero tolerance actually means zero corruption or zero competition. Because when yesterday's loyalists become today's handcuffed villains, the problem usually isn't that corruption was discovered. The problem is that corruption stopped being shared. And in Georgia right now, the people being paraded into court are not random. They are curated and politically useful. Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Last October, anti-corruption investigators in Georgia searched 22 locations linked not to opposition figures, but to individuals long associated with the ruling Georgian Dream party. Among those targeted were former Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili, as well as other senior officials. For months, authorities in Tbilisi have focused their pressure on pro-EU opposition leaders, jailing prominent critics after parliamentary elections last October that the opposition denounced as rigged. The governing party claimed victory, the streets claimed fraud. Since then, Georgia has been suspended between protests and paralysis. The October 2025 crackdown seemingly took a different turn, targeting Georgian Dream insiders. Garibashvili, twice prime minister and widely viewed as a close ally of billionaire power broker Bidzina Ivanishvili, embodies the political core of the Georgian Dream movement. The party has long faced accusations of democratic backsliding and quiet drift toward Moscow, charges it rejects, insisting it remains committed to Georgia's constitutional path towards EU membership. Following the crackdown, Garibashvili appeared in court charged with large-scale money laundering, which he later pleaded guilty to. Prosecutors say that when investigators raided his home, they discovered $6.5 million in cash. In January, Garibashvili was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. The scale of the case transforms what began as coordinated searches into a profound political movement for Georgia's ruling establishment. Whether these raids signal genuine accountability or an internal recalibration is unclear, but in a system where power has appeared tightly consolidated, even the image of investigators entering the homes of insiders alters the atmosphere. In Georgia's unsettled politics, that alone is consequential.
And now let's zone in on the explaining portion of our show. Critics have argued that Georgian Dream used anti-corruption authorities as means to consolidate party power. Yet last November, the Georgian government announced that the country's anti-corruption bureau would be abolished by March. This begs the questions. Do Georgia's anti-corruption authorities exist to genuinely tackle corruption, or do they exist merely for political control? As always, here is a closer look.
On November 17th, the Georgian government announced that the nation's Anti-Corruption Bureau would be abolished on March 2nd, with its responsibilities transferred to the State Audit Office. The Anti-Corruption Bureau was originally established in 2022 as part of reforms linked to the country's European Union candidacy process. The Anti-Corruption Bureau was tasked with drafting anti-graft strategies, overseeing political party financing, protecting whistleblowers, and monitoring asset declarations of public officials. Some critics argue that the body lacked genuine independence from its inception and failed to pursue credible high-level corruption cases. At the same time, several civil society organizations say the Bureau increasingly targeted independent media and NGOs, requesting sensitive documentation and expanding legal demands throughout 2025. Parliamentary Speaker Shalva Papuashvili described the move as an effort to optimize state resources and consolidate functions within what he called a more independent constitutional body. The decision also comes amid growing tensions between Tbilisi and Brussels. Georgia secured EU candidate status in December 2023, but EU officials have since warned of serious democratic backsliding, and accession talks were suspended in 2024.
And now we're zooming in on Tbilisi to take a look at the issue in greater detail. When a government announces a zero-tolerance campaign against corruption, you're supposed to feel reassured. When that campaign focuses almost exclusively on former insiders, you're going to feel something else entirely: suspicion. In Georgia, the ruling Georgian Dream party wants credit for finally discovering corruption, years after journalists, NGOs and civil society mapped it in painstaking detail. Over the past months, arrests have rippled through the ruling party's former inner circle. The most dramatic example is the detention and sentencing of former Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili, once the closest political ally of Bidzina Ivanishvili, the party's founder and de facto power center. Garibashvili's fall is not a story about sudden moral awakening, but about how loyalty in systems like this expires faster than milk in the Tbilisi summer. If this were a genuine anti-corruption drive, the investigations would be wide, structural, and probably really boring. Now, Georgia's watchdogs have been shouting about elite corruption for years. The difference is that now some of those elites have become politically redundant. Look at the pattern. Garibashvili's network is under pressure. Another power center linked to the former security chief, Grigor Liluashvili, is under pressure too. Now, that is not how impartial law enforcement looks like. When the law suddenly wakes up only around two specific camps, the law is being aimed, not waking up to face real danger. This is where the Georgian Dream's messaging collapses under its own weight. For years, the party insisted that corruption was exaggerated, politicized, or even non-existent. Now, it insists corruption was real but conveniently limited to people who are no longer politically useful. That contradiction is the strategy. Deny corruption when it threatens the system, acknowledge corruption when it helps restructure that very same system. What makes this moment more consequential is that it reflects a deeper shift inside the regime. For years, Georgian Dream functioned as a loose coalition of power brokers. Think of it as a horizontal corruption market. Different groups, revenue streams, different political patrons, all orbiting around Ivanishvili. What we are watching now is verticalization. Power is being pulled upward. Financial flows are being centralized. Independent fiefdoms inside the party are being dismantled. Not because corruption is immoral, but because decentralized corruption is inefficient and harder to control. This is how regimes evolve when they lose their ideological cover. Georgian Dream no longer offers a coherent project beyond staying in power. When you lack a unifying vision, you compensate with discipline and money. Former allies who built their own networks become competitors. Competitors become potential risks. And potential risks, as we can see, quickly become defendants. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is George Mjedlishvili, Associate Professor at the European University in Tbilisi. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Right, so let's first take a look at the character himself. The man himself accused of corruption, but previously quite high in the power structure. Irakli Garibashvili, can you tell us more about his history within the Georgian Dream Party? And how did it happen that from the very top he is now effectively landed as a person convicted of corruption?
Well, it usually happens at some point, revolution devours its own children, and this is exactly the power struggle within this ruling party. It has been happening before in Georgia, so when a certain political force gains the monopoly of the control, then, it starts the kind of internal debates and internal squabblings and internal political fight, and this fight usually ends, with very, I would say, violent and very, non-democratic and diplomatic outcomes. So, Irakli Garibashvili was a key figure of the ruling party before it became a ruling. He owns a significant portion of his political capital and personality to Ivanishvili. They were business partners. He does possess a serious business acumen. He's a gifted person. At a very young age, he became the prime minister of Georgia. He was a good financier. So previously, he was educated in France. He's very fluent in French and English. And for a certain period of time, he was a key figure and one of these stalwarts of the political force by the name of Georgian Dream. But there was a fallout a few years ago, and usually fallout doesn't end nicely. Usually, when there is a political fight or the kind of like neutralization of political opponent, usually is the outcome.
So now, looking at his career, you've mentioned that he was prime minister. He was actually prime minister twice. And now, what is of interest is especially the second term and what he was doing during that period, so as not to get the impression that he was some sort of internal dissenter. He was actually one of the main architects of the system as it is today, right?
Exactly. He was beside Rewiński from day one, even before day one, when they were in opposition, when the party was persecuted by the previous authoritarian government. So, and again, so, his choice as the first prime minister was almost non-negotiable. Initially, Rewiński himself became the prime minister as an interim politician. Then he announced his desire to leave the politics. And the kind of the most probable, kind of the pretty much the open and shut case as to who will become the prime minister was Rewiński. He was literally the right hand of Rewiński, and his initial period was, I would say, rather successful because Georgia got the association agreement with the European Union under his watch in 2014. Later on, so his activities and his close cooperation with the European bureaucracy, European institutions, United States, saw to it that Georgia received the visa-free travel with the European Union in early 2017. He was no longer the prime minister at the time, but kind of it is believed that so the next prime minister built upon his legacy. So generally, he was a fairly pro-Western, like fairly conservative leaning, but center-right politician, even though his political affiliation in the European Union was the Social Democrats, center-left party. So he was a fairly kind of, I would say, reliable partner and always a first choice. Yes, he's being the prime minister, but for a time he was the minister of defense. And again, people who worked alongside him at the time discuss him and describe him as a successful and very business-oriented minister. Later, he became the prime minister. Well, I think that after 2022 and this aggression against Ukraine, certain fallouts and certain conflicts within the party started again. So one has to be either an insider or former insider to know what exactly happened. But well, we are at this stage now.
Well, you've mentioned that during his first term, he did actually gave off an impression that he was fairly pro-Western, not very radical. This appears to have changed later on, right? Because he was, for example, one of the people that participated in the process of, the gradual backsliding, right? The legislation that was introduced there, the first attempt at the so-called foreign agents law, that was all his doing, right?
Exactly. When I personally, some other people started to suspect that not everything is fair, probably was the initial stages of this Russian aggression, full-scale aggression against Ukraine, when he made a point of not joining the sanctions. Well, it could have been done far more diplomatically. Obviously, the Georgian economy is precarious, is weak, and Georgia could hardly afford actually joining this chorus of sanctions, meaningful sanctions against Russia. But the way it was put, the way he distanced himself from supporting Ukraine, even verbally, was pretty palpable, was conspicuous, and well, maybe that was the moment when his political persona changed, so to speak.
So he accused NATO of being guilty of the whole situation in Ukraine, of the Russian aggression, which of course does not correspond with the facts. But now let's talk about the whys. Essentially, we have a regime insider, formerly at the very top of the game, a close associate to Rewiński himself. But now, is he becoming a scapegoat for the system? Is there an internal rivalry, or is it about something else? Is it perhaps about sharing the profits from some illegal activity which is going on behind the scenes? Because still, we don't have the details. But if a man is suddenly found with 6.5 million euro, I believe, in his flat, I'm assuming that was cash, massive amounts. Later on, he goes on into plea bargaining stage, accepts a sentence of 5 years in prison. Basically, he could have got much more. But still, his political career doesn't seem to be going anywhere right now. And this begs the question, why him? And why is it happening now?
Again, we can only speculate. Maybe it is this process of internal like cleaning the ranks of the party. Maybe there was a fallout with the other center of another henchman of Ivanishvili, another
like the current
person.
prime minister, Irakli Kobakidze?
Exactly, the current prime minister is one of these kind of the usual suspects in this particular regard. Maybe it was kind of this internal squabble between them. Maybe there is another center of power among the people who actually kind of in the close circle of Ivanishvili. I can only speculate in this particular regard. When again, at this stage, I would abstain from actually kind of making these responsible statements in this particular regard. It's really kind of difficult to say, but obviously it doesn't bode well for this future of party if they either try to find a scapegoat or try to kind of clean the ranks. And again, it is not difficult to determine on what criteria they want to do it.
He was not the only person that was actually facing corruption charges now. Do you think this points towards, if not a purge, then perhaps a consolidation with the power structure becoming more vertical so that control could be exercised more easily? And again, this would tie in with the democratic backsliding, the system becoming more authoritarian, and so control becomes a priority. Do you think that there is evidence that this could be happening?
Well, either evidence or the usual trend in Georgian politics for 35 years of the Georgian independence. So this is kind of this repeated story. This is the cycle. A political force comes to power. It comes to power with the hope of appending and clearing this the legacy of the previous leadership. They usually start well. They are successful, but at some point they slide. They catch this authoritarian bug, which becomes more and more intensified. So very unfortunately, we see that when the government doesn't change for 2-3 electoral cycles, it becomes far more prone to abuse of power, and that's we have been witnessing over the past few years.
You've mentioned
again, not for the first time.
Yes, I mean at the beginning you've mentioned that this is a case of the revolution devouring its own children. Could it also be that there are no institutional safeguards, and that this might have been convenient for those people when they were in power? But right now, when Mr. Garibashvili or anyone else who formerly used to be a part of the power structure would like to invoke any sort of protections against that, these measures are no longer there because the system has become more streamlined. So it's easier to actually pass sentences for corruption or any other accusations which are there. And the victim essentially has few opportunities to fight back.
So exactly, it is less about political structures, institutions, and checks and balances, because formally some checks and balances mechanisms are in place. Georgia on several occasions changed the system. It was initially parliamentarian, then became strongly presidential. Then it proved to be actually the power concentrated too much in the hands of one person. Then it became more diluted. Now the president is pretty much a figurehead. Now we have a parliamentarian, but again, when you have a one-party parliament, which I think it was despite very, very questionable election of 2024, I believe that decision not to enter parliament was a mistake on the part of opposition, then we could have a more meaningful political fight, political dialogue, and maybe kind of this consolidation of authoritarian power will be less palpable. I believe the lack of political participation, and it boils down to the lack of political culture still. 35 years into independence, Georgia still keeps repeating this one-party cycle. That's one of the reasons, probably the chief reason why Georgia needs European Union and actually closer integration, because this is a political lessons which we failed to learn so far. Yes, Georgian society is more or less prepared. Well, there are certain political healthy forces in this society, even in political spectrum, but significantly to a lesser extent, very unfortunately. So, and here we come to the situation when the lack of political culture, lack of the experience of democratic government leads to such a sad outcome.
George Mchedlishvili was our guest today here on the Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
And now, moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Regional experts warn that Russian authorities in occupied Crimea have likely built comprehensive training infrastructure for unmanned aerial systems. Reports continue to surface that the peninsula has become a key personnel training hub for Russia's war effort.
Moscow-installed Crimean leader Sergei Aksyonov claims the region now supports a complete training cycle for UAVs. That includes recruiting school children and students and placing them into a reserve pool for the Russian army. Courses are held at multiple training grounds across Crimea. Some programs reportedly last more than 50 days, with thousands believed to have been trained. Experts say the system combines youth militarization programs with combat training for active soldiers.
More than 1,000 Kenyans have traveled to fight for the Russian army in Ukraine, according to an intelligence report presented to Kenya's parliament. Officials say most were tricked into signing military contracts.
The joint investigation by Kenya's National Intelligence Service and Directorate of Criminal Investigations puts the figure far higher than earlier government estimates of around 200. Lawmakers were told recruits typically leave on tourist visas and transit through Istanbul or Abu Dhabi before reaching Russia. Unlicensed recruitment agencies are also reportedly working with rogue airport staff. Kenya's parliamentary majority leader, Kimani Ichung'wah, added that tighter controls at Nairobi's main airport have pushed some recruits to travel through other African countries to avoid detection. Kenyan Foreign Minister Musalia Mudavadi is expected to visit Moscow next month to address the issue.
Moldovan police said on the 19th of February that they launched a joint investigation with Ukrainian authorities into an alleged plot to assassinate several public figures in Ukraine. Officials claim the operation was directed by Russian security services.
Investigative efforts began early Thursday morning as part of a joint task force involving Moldovan police and Ukrainian law enforcement. Authorities have not disclosed the intended targets or how far the alleged plots had progressed. The case adds to a series of investigations across Europe into suspected Russian-linked operations since the start of the full-scale invasion. Kyiv has repeatedly accused Russian intelligence services of planning assassinations and sabotage inside Ukraine. Officials say more details in the Moldovan-led investigation will be released after the procedural steps are completed.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.